And we are going to record this session. It's going to be posted on the St. Killian YouTube, as all of our other training sessions are, for those who couldn't make it tonight. So this training is going to cover tax preparation for California state filers, which all of our clients should be. And Jerry Muir is going to be presenting it. Before we get started, I know it's not the most convenient time, so some folks are just logging in. We're going to spend a couple minutes here just going over what was covered in the dry run this past Saturday. A few people couldn't make it due to other commitments or being exposed to COVID and so forth. So we did go through a walkthrough of the whole parking lot situation and how we will accept clients down there, do the intake screening, check all the documents, make photocopies of a few documents if they're missing, and then send our customers on their way with a secret passcode that they'll use for identification purposes later on. We also made a modification from previous years where we are going to attempt to do some tax filing right there in the parking lot. So we have a number of volunteers who want to give that a crack. We will have 5 or 6 computers at the same place where our administration usually is. And folks stationed there will be able to take the documents. I'm assuming this is mostly going to apply for basic tax returns. It might be a little difficult for the advanced, but we'll see what we can do. And we'll key it right into the computer with TaxSlayer running. We do have a pretty good Wi-Fi system down there, so it should work as far as the electronics goes. And we can do the filing and the quality review right there, and then have the customer sign and file their return in one trip, just like we used to do when we were able to do it inside the building. So we'll be testing that out this weekend, see how it works. And we also went over the security and computer protocols. Whoops. Can you guys still hear me? Because it looks like my internet is a little unstable. Jerry, can you hear me?
Yeah, still hear you.
Okay. Sorry for that. I don't have the greatest Wi-Fi here, but we did talk about security requirements. So for the people who are doing virtual tax processing, you need to have a computer that's running Windows 10. This is a IRS requirement. That's the only operating system that they support for TaxSlayer. And you also need to be running a virus program. It has to actively be running on your computer to prevent any kind of compromise of the data. In addition to that, you want to use the current browser, whether that's the Microsoft Edge or the most recent versions of Chrome or Firefox. If you have questions about other browsers, you could contact Steve Loretto and he'll let you know if they're okay. For the process, we want to make sure that we're protecting personal information of any of our clients. So remember that you don't want to be printing out documents in your home. If you do need to print something to be able to read it, you have to shred those documents at the end of dealing with that taxpayer. If you don't have a shredder at home, you can bring it down to the parking lot on Saturday mornings. We have high-speed shredders down there. Any PDF files that you save on your computer, you need to remember to delete those when you're done. And when you view the PDF, it always saves it in your download files. So you'll have to go and look for those and delete them after you deal with each taxpayer. For those who haven't done the virtual process before, the way it works, we accept all of the documents from our taxpayers in the parking lot. We scan them into the system in a secure folder in something that's called a OneDrive system, which Mel is setting up right now. That is password protected, and only the person who's preparing taxes will be allowed to see each individual taxpayer's files. If you're going to be preparing that individual, you will get a notice from the site coordinator saying that you're preparing that file with a link to the OneDrive folder for that taxpayer. You'll go in there, all their records will be there. You can open up TaxSlayer, access their files, enter all the information into TaxSlayer. And then when you're done, you'll contact the taxpayer to make sure that the information is correct. You'll indicate that the taxes are ready for review and save that in TaxSlayer with the ready for review flag, and somebody will be assigned to do quality review. If you're doing quality reviews, you've probably already done the virtual process before and you know how it works, but it's very similar to what's going on with virtual tax preparation. Last time I checked, we had about 25 people qualified advanced, which is really good. Last year, we were doing it with about a dozen, and we were able to get through 440. So we are looking forward to a little bit of a break for the people doing virtual tax preparation this year. I know I was doing sometimes 15 or 20 tax returns in a week, and it does eat up a lot of your time if you're doing that many. So we're hoping to keep it down to just a couple per week per reviewer, and that's about it. So let's see, we got about 10 people on the line, and I've got 5 or 6 minutes after 6. So I'll turn it over to Jerry and he can take over.
Okay, thank you. So again, this is a focus tonight on the California return. My name is Jerry Muir. I met some of you at the parking lot on Saturday. So it's pretty exciting to see not only a number of returning volunteers, but some new volunteers. So that I think that's a real good thing. A couple of things you might want to jot down, and if you've been with us on some of the sessions, we talked about these documents before, but as a refresher, the Franchise Tax Board, there's 2 publications that you might want to have at the ready or take a look at between now and when you start assisting taxpayers. The first one from the Franchise Tax Board is publication 5130. And the 5130 is the Vita California Volunteer Reference Manual. And that 5130 was published in November of 2021. So I think that'll help you out, give you some pointers. It does talk about what are called conformity and non-conformity issues. When you hear that term, it simply means that on certain items, the state of California conforms essentially to federal tax law, if you will. And for non-conformity, that means California is not going to agree. For example, on the California lottery, the feds tax it, but the state of California does not. So that would be conformity, non-conformity. So again, get yourself the 5130. It's available electronically. I'm not sure if you can get a hard copy, but you can pretty much get about anything you want from the Franchise Tax Board on their website. And then another document is called the Franchise Tax Board Publication 1001. And that 1001 is the Supplemental Guidelines to California Adjustments. And that'll also help you out when you're preparing returns. Okay, so what I have in front of us is I do have the actual TaxSlayer Vita software. This is what it's going to look like when you start logging on as a preparer or as a quality reviewer. Now, of course, this one is from the college that I teach at. We also have our own program. So you'll see references to Coastline College. Okay, so I've entered the information for a taxpayer in the software already. So what we're going to do, we're going to jump into the client's return. I'm going to navigate through it and explain a few things, and then we'll jump into the California portion of the return. So let's go ahead and open up my return that I entered. And this will be for a taxpayer by the name, first name is Test, and his last name is Tax Return. So Test Tax Return, let's open that up. And we're going to go start at the very beginning and talk a little bit about things that you probably have heard of. Maybe this might be a refresher for some of you, but let's go ahead and start at the beginning. In our Vita program, a lot of our filers are going to be single, married filing joint, or head of household. We do not assist individuals. That's the general rule. We do not assist them for a married filing separate return. If someone has something like that, you're simply going to have to tell them that's out of scope. And if you get into your publication, your IRS publication 4012, there's a lot of things out of scope. And it simply means that the taxpayer will have to go somewhere else to get the return completed. Okay, so we've got a head of household filer. And you might remember when you enter data, you want to make sure you have the first name and the last name per the Social Security card. And that's why when you're looking at that package, all the documents the taxpayer presents, they'll have copies of their Social Security card. And again, the name needs to match that. Because what happens is when the return is electronically filed, the return will essentially be matched against the Social Security database. And if there's differences in the name, then you'll have a rejected return, which means more work for the St. Killian's Vita team. All right, and then in this software, you must have a date of birth to get past it. And you don't need an occupation. You can get past that, but I'll throw one in, a worker. And a couple things about the first page here under the name. There's a lot of different boxes. These are the ones that you will probably see or become familiar with. Sometimes you'll have a taxpayer who is a young adult and they're attending college. And if that's the case, if they're over 18, you'll check that. We did talk about blind taxpayers, and last season I assisted a taxpayer who was blind. And there's a tax definition of blindness that's in the publication 17. And so what that means is that individual's gone to an ophthalmologist, which would be an eye doctor, and the eye doctor says, here's your vision, and they'll give them some type of script, i.e. a piece of paper, and that taxpayer then may be able to claim that blind indicator here. Now, the purpose behind that is you'll have a larger standard deduction if the individual is blind. Sometimes when we assist taxpayers, they've lost their husbands, wives, maybe their sons, or maybe a brother. And if that's the case, then typically that taxpayer is filing that final return. And a lot of times there's a refund, so you'd indicate a deceased taxpayer. Sometimes our folks want to contribute money to the presidential election campaign fund. And what that means is this is an order to the federal government to segregate or separate monies. And for this particular fund, it's not going to affect the tax return, i.e. it's not going to reduce the refund. It's just an order from the taxpayer to put money aside for people who run for president. And when they qualify, then they're going to get money from the federal government. And this is something that you will see. We saw this last year. So what happens is if individuals want to use their 2019 earned income to figure their 2021 earned income, they can do so. Of course, that means they have to have information from 2019. And so if that's the case, again, the whole purpose behind that, Congress says we're going to allow this to increase the earned income tax credit for taxpayers. And so you may see that. And then when you talk about virtual currency, I think just about everybody that I talked to in the last couple of years is interested in buying it, or they bought it, or they've sold it. If you have someone who owns virtual currency, for example, I guess the popular one is Bitcoin, what that means is they own a capital asset. And when you own a capital asset and then you dispose of it, i.e. you relinquish title, then you may have to calculate that gain or loss. So if they've got some type of virtual currency and they sold it, we cannot help them in the Vita program. If they've purchased virtual currency and they're holding it, we can assist them because they haven't disposed of it. And then you might remember this from some of you reading taxpayers, because a lot of our taxpayers, they speak a different language. English is not their first language. And so they can get written communication in language other than English. And that came out, I believe that was last year that it came out. Okay, so we have an address, and this is important, especially if you've worked at the IRS or you've ever dealt with the IRS. The rule is you have to maintain a mailing address, some type of current address with the IRS, and it's the taxpayer's responsibility to provide that information to the IRS. And you're thinking, well, what's the big deal, Jerry? Well, here's the big deal. Let's say the IRS has an official correspondence they're going to send you. They will send it to your last known address. That's the statutory requirement. And if it doesn't get to you, then it's on you. So what that means is I always tell people when you're moving, typically you tell your mom or your dad, maybe you're going to tell your brother and your sister, you might tell your wife, you might tell your friends, you're going to tell your work, and you're probably going to tell the franchise tax board and the IRS that you've moved. You should do that. because again, those official correspondences from both the state and the federal government will go to your current address. So that's important. If you are moving, you should take that affirmative act and make sure people know your new address. This offer, of course, requires a phone number. I always tell my volunteers, if you have a married couple and you've got 2 numbers, that's pretty typical. Make sure you put that in there, because if I need to get a hold of a taxpayer, sometimes it'll be an email, sometimes it'll be calling their phone. And if no one answers, I'll call the spouse and say, I'm trying to get a hold of so-and-so. Oh, that's my spouse. Okay, well, can you put them on the phone? Can you put her on the phone? So it's really good to capture that information. Sometimes we don't call the taxpayers, but when we do, we like to have those numbers. Okay, we're going to hit continue. In this particular case, our taxpayer has a dependent child. And in the Vita program, you're going to see a lot of this. And so our dependent child, his name is Jay. And so I'm going to open that up. And we're just going to look at this. And this should be familiar to you if you have completed the basic and the advanced certification, which I think most of you have. So we populate that. Again, we want to make sure the name matches the Social Security database. So it's per the Social Security card. So we're not going to put a nickname in. Date of birth is important. Now, this is something I know St. Killian's does, which is great. They're going to ask for not necessarily birth certificates, but they're going to ask that date of birth. You're not required to get the birth certificate. And I have never seen that at a Vita site, but if they provide it, great. But again, the moms and dads should know the date of birth of the kids. I do recognize I've talked to taxpayers, and quite frankly, some of them have forgotten. But again, you want to get that correct, because what happens is when the return is electronically filed, that database from the Social Security Administration will include a name, a Social Security number, and of course, a date of birth. So you want to get that right. And then, of course, we know what a U.S. citizen is. That means you were born in the U.S. typically, or maybe you've come to the U.S. and you're a visitor here, you're a resident alien for a long period of time, or you were naturalized. So typically, you're going to be seeing U.S. citizens and resident aliens. And of course, we're going to capture what is called a taxpayer identification number, which for our purposes will be a Social Security number, or in some cases, an ITIN. An ITIN is an individual taxpayer identification number. And what that means is the individual has submitted information to the IRS, and they're eligible for that ITIN, which means they have an ITIN letter from the IRS. But a lot of our folks do have socials. And so we're gonna populate that, son or daughter, the number of months in the home. And you can see all of these boxes at the bottom. Typically, you're going to be using that first one if you got a young adult who's going to college. And when you hear the term eligible educational institution, typically that's going to be a 2 or 4 year college. And they do have to participate in the U.S. Department of Education grant and loan program. And so, for example, I know a guy went to a real estate school for 6 weeks to become a real estate agent in the state of California. That is not an eligible educational institution. So for our purposes, if you're based in Orange County, Saddleback College, that's an educational institution. Cal State Fullerton, UCI, those are eligible educational institutions for the purposes of the education credits. And that's about all you're going to see. Here's another point. I've seen this a couple times, but once you start preparing returns, you're going to know this. But if you're brand new, sometimes you're going to have an individual who has a dependent who has earned income. We're talking about as a wage earner. If you have earned income and you're 16 years of age, you may or may not have a requirement. But if you do want to file your return and get a refund, you got to file your own return. You can't add son and daughter's income to that. All right, so we're done with that. And of course, we know if you have an additional dependent, you would add that up here. You would indicate that with that check mark. Death certificate, again, if you have someone has passed away, you're going to get that death certificate from the loved one. And then again, typically there'll be a refund sent to that individual. You do see that once in a while in the Vita program. Here's something you do see from time to time, the IPPIN, which is the Identity Protection Personal Identification Number. And what is someone notifies the IRS that their ID has been compromised. And if you don't have an IPPIN and someone's compromised your Social Security number, if you file your return electronically, it's going to be kicked back. So that identity protection PIN, it's as simple as letter